Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome. You've all come in from the cold for tonight's special conversation. It is such a thrill to be here with Ben Macintyre. I've been looking forward to this 4 weeks. The day after leaving Cambridge University, Ben was taken to a basement for a very brief exchange with MI6. And it was very brief because they just weren't interested. They took one look at him and realised this was a man that was going to write everything down. So he went on to study journalism, or to be a journalist. He didn't study, say it's a trade, isn't it? You didn't study it.
No, you can't study it.
And a former foreign correspondent, in fact, in the great hardship posts of Paris, Washington and New York.
That's right, I slummed it. Yep.
But he's worked now for the Times for about 35 years. And for many of those years, of course, he started to write these wonderful, wonderful books and selling them by the millions, including titles like 𝐭𝐻𝐭𝐡𝐭, Operation Nimrod, The Spy and the Traitor, and his latest book, The Siege. And it is a wonderful book, which will be the main focus of our conversation tonight, but not the only one. So please, a warm Melbourne welcome for Ben Macintyre.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. What a lovely introduction that was. Yes, now I remember my interview with MI6 very vividly. I'd spent the last week at university at Cambridge because I knew who the spy recruiter was. He was my history tutor, and so and word had got around. So I spent about, well, actually it was more like a month trying to look as sort of sinister but worldly as I could, in the hope that he would sort of tap me on the shoulder. And sure enough, he did. So off I trotted to go and talk to them. It was ridiculous.
The little sort of Cambridge dangle.
The Cambridge dangle. I mean, they realised very quickly that I was not the man for the job because, as I've just demonstrated, I can't keep a secret. I mean, I signed the Official Secrets Act at the end of that interview, and I've broken it more or less daily ever since.
Well, it's very fortunate for all of us that you didn't get drawn into that, and your career. It seems to me there's been 2 really important bits of timing for you to be you, and one of them is that it aligned with the opening up of a lot of previously secret documents, and the second one is that. More recently, I suppose, that your kind of history has become very cool.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I mean, both those things are true, and I've been extraordinarily lucky. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here if the British government had not begun in the early 90s to declassify material that was hitherto totally secret. And that went for most MI5 files are now released on a 50-year cycle. And they're just the most wonderful resource for a historian because these are archives that are never meant to be read by people like you and me. They're meant to be secret. And so they're honest in a way that most government archives are not. Most people who leave archival material as part of a sort of government institution know that it's going to be read at some point, and so they frame it in a particular way. That's not true of these files because they're never meant to get out. So when it goes wrong, and it frequently goes wrong, they actually write in the margins of these documents, we're completely screwed here. You know, this is a disaster. I'm furious with Fred. She's trying to get off with him. You know, so you actually get the kind of reality of a sort of breaking, unfolding spy case from minute to minute, and I would never have been able to write this stuff.
And that'll probably change in the future too, won't it, with digital
I don't know how people are going to write contemporary history. I mean, we all think that we're preserving history in our emails and our texts. Well, we're not. And as far as the intelligence services go, they are now routinely destroying digital material that might have legal implications, which is so different from the wartime and the Cold War files where they're breaking the law all the time and they don't care. You know, that's what you do. You know, if you're MI6, you go abroad and try and persuade citizens of other countries to break their own laws. That's the story. Well, all of that stuff is being expunged from their records. So I don't know what historians of the future are going to do. But you're also right in a way about the narrative non-fiction element of it. I mean, it's strange. I mean, when I was sort of studying history all those many years ago in Cambridge, there really wasn't a sort of narrative historical tradition. People didn't really do it. I mean, you either had very, very scholarly history on the one hand, which was what historians were supposed to be, or you had kind of fantasy history, sort of novelized history, half fact, half fiction, which of course doesn't work for me either. So the actual narrative history wasn't really done.
Well, when we read your books, of course, why would you make anything up?
Well,
you couldn't make these stories up.
I always love those bits when you discover a fact that is so strange and so unlikely.
Well, let's start with the siege and just to set the scene of the. A lot of people who were devoted to the West Wing in 2001 when it was first showing will remember that it used to show here on a Tuesday night, and everybody who watched the West Wing saw 9/11 happen. We saw it cut, to
Really?
switched from the West Wing to what was going on in New York that day.
Wow.
And it's a bit of a thing among West Wing viewers. Now, of course, for you, it was the World Snooker Championships, which you're going to take over in a moment to set the scene. But I just think I have to. It was sponsored by Embassy Cigarettes.
Brilliant. Those were the days.
So you were watching it?
I was watching it. I was 17. It was the World Embassy Snooker Final. It was as exciting as snooker ever gets. Yeah. I mean, it was down to the final frame. It was Hurricane Higgins against Cliff the Grinder Thorburn. And it was a bank holiday Monday, and my dad and I were lying on the sofa watching this snooker. And suddenly the screen went black, and the announcer said, it's a brilliant, brilliant sporting segue, said, and now we go from one embassy to another. and the television was sort of taken over. All three channels, by the way.
The first time.
Well, except actually, to be fair, not all three channels, because Coronation Street was on one of the channels, and you can't break into Coronation Street.
And they didn't.
So they had to wait for another minute and a half. But so all three eventually went live, and there was this live footage of men in balaclava helmets with machine guns abseiling down the outside of a building, throwing bombs into it, and then attacking it. And the building instantly caught fire. I'd never seen anything. At first, I thought it was a film. I thought our old black and white television had just gone wrong, and suddenly it was showing some action movie by accident. But it wasn't. This was real breaking news in a way that we're sort of familiar with this now. I mean, we sort of rather expect it on our televisions. Then it was completely unprecedented. No one had ever seen breaking news like that coming straight into your living room. And I think it was one of the reasons, actually, that I became a journalist in the end, is I thought it was so extraordinary that news could be so vivid and so immediate and so electrifying, actually. And that was the first time that many people had ever heard of the SAS. I mean, they had been a not completely, but largely obscure organisation up until that point.
And it was obviously around the world. This was a story that anybody born really at that time, I remember it. I was very, very little. But it's a story we think we know.
Yeah.
So tell us what we don't tell us what's most important about the siege that we need to understand. And that you discovered in turning such a lens to it? Well,
I thought I knew what it was about. I assumed that it was the Iranian embassy, and therefore it must have been something to do with Islamic fundamentalism, that these must have been extremist, fundamentalist terrorists. That was completely wrong. They absolutely were not. These were 6 young Arabs from the southwest of Iran. They were attacking the Iranian embassy because it was a symbol of the Ayatollah, because the Ayatollah had taken power. The Ayatollah's security service had brutally repressed the sort of protest movement that was taking place among the Arab minority in Iran. And they had selected the embassy in order to attack the Ayatollah. So they were opposed to the Ayatollah. The reason they had chosen Britain, in a way, was because they felt that the British were also opposed to the Ayatollah and therefore would give them a good hearing. It was an astonishingly naive effort, really. And it was all, again, a thing I had no idea about. It was all bankrolled and trained and organized by Saddam Hussein. This was an Iraqi plot to destabilize the Iranian government. It was really the precursor to the Iran-Iraq war, which would erupt 5 months later. And this was a very cynical manipulation by Saddam and his terrifying security service, the Mukhabarat, to use these young men to forward his political aims. And they were manipulated. They were idiots. I mean, like most people drawn into terrorist plots, they really had no idea what they were doing. Look, I'm not making a case for them. They were, they were men of violence. They were prepared to kill and they were prepared to die. But they had a cause and they had a reason for doing what they were doing. Not a justification, but a reason. And again, that was something I knew nothing about, that there was a whole story behind this event that had been really obscured by the mythology, in a way. I mean, this is such a central moment in British and indeed in world, but particularly for Britons. This is a really central cultural moment. It's a bit of a JFK moment. I mean, it's a where were you when it happened. And it transformed British politics. It had huge impact. And yet it seemed to me that it was very little understood. As an event, it had been turned into a symbol, if you like, and not really something real, not something human and explicable.
There was certainly a sense in the whole story that the terrorists had no clue of the cast of characters they were going to find in that embassy. And it is, it was very journalism top heavy, just for starters. There's 6 or 8 of them, I think, had some connection to journalists. A couple of BBC journalists happened to be in there. There's an Iranian spy who's working in there. I mean, tell us about this group of people where it's almost as remarkable to me that they didn't try and kill each other in there, given their differences. Well,
that's absolutely right, Sally. I mean, so the 6 gunmen burst in, firing machine guns, and there were 26 people in the building, and they took them all hostage. And they would hold them for 6 days. So there was a long, long standoff with the police. But what the gunmen were not expecting was that there were all sorts of different people in this building. They had expected it to be filled with pro-Ayatollah Iranian diplomats. That was the aim. They were going to take them hostage. They were going to barter them, in effect, for Arab prisoners held in Iran. They wanted to have their message read out on the BBC, and then they were going to go home. They believed that the British government would provide them with an aeroplane, and they could fly back to the Middle East. I mean, it sounds absurd. Actually, in the context of 1970s terrorism, it wasn't completely outlandish.
It was fairly fashionable at that stage.
It was,
and
governments were still willing to negotiate with terrorists at this point. What they had failed to take into account was one very important factor, and that was Margaret Thatcher, who did not negotiate with terrorists, and that's another whole part of the story. But so inside this building, 26 people, some of them were senior Iranian diplomats, mostly political appointees, people who'd only been there a short time since the revolution in 1979, a year before. But there were also lots of support staff, Iranians, who had worked for the Shah's regime before, so they were kind of holdovers. There were, as you say, a number of journalists who were there applying for visas. There were many women inside the building, again, whose story has never been told. And again, we might get onto that. But, there were 6 women in there. They were all secretaries who worked for the place. And their stories are extraordinary, too. And bringing those to life, I hope, was one of the great pleasures of this story. So the gunmen, in a way, were baffled by this broad array of people that they were never expecting to have to deal with. There were also, there are comic elements to this story, because I think this happens in sort of very tense situations, that a sort of inadvertent comedy begins to bubble up. There were people in there who were literally tourists There's a particular character who I love in this story called 𝐴𝐵 who was a Pakistani tourist who just happened he was quite portly, and he was a bit tired of walking around Hyde Park because the building looks out on Hyde Park. And he thought he'd have a bit of a sit down. So he went into the waiting room. He later claimed that he'd been going in there because he knew someone in the embassy. Well, he really didn't. He was just a bit fat and he wanted to sit down for a little while. And he was caught up in this extraordinary drama. And he never quite worked out what was going on because he kept saying to the gunman, I've got a plane to catch. Can I go now? And they kept having to say to him, well, it's not quite like that. You're actually a hostage.
I think the BBC guy was wanting to go out and feed his parking meter.
That's right. I mean, again, this inadvertent humour sort of bubbled up where they said, well, if he's going to go and catch his plane, I've got a ticket. I've got an underground ticket to Highgate. Can I go? Can I go now as well? Yeah.
The other thing that bubbled up, and I love the way you contextualise this. There's a brilliant Australian novel called The Middle Parts of Fortune.
Fortune, yes.
Frederick Manning.
Yeah, I remember it.
And he captures boredom, the boredom of conflict.
Of the First World War.
Yes,
yeah.
like I think very few writers do. And that boredom seems to be a great theme of, I mean, it was 6 days, but it must have felt like 6 lifetimes in many ways. And so you've got one of your SAS guys, waiting around for days to be sent in, and he's reading The Hobbit. Yeah. And then you've got a hostage, I can't remember which one, who's reading The Day of the Jackal, because it happened to be in the bookshelf.
I mean, if you're stuck in a hostage terrorist drama, the last thing you'd really want to read is The Day of the Jackal.
Tell me about this idea of boredom.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think boredom is one of the great underestimated forces in human life. Everybody experiences boredom at some point. And boredom can make you do all sorts of strange and unlikely things. And the truth is, even the gunmen, after 6 days, were getting bored. They weren't getting anything. It was all incredibly tense, and everybody thought they were going to die. But you can be terrified for your life and bored at the same time. Isn't that a strange thought? But it's undoubtedly true. And one of the triggers for the explosive end of this story was the boredom of the gunmen. They got so bored, they began drawing graffiti on the walls of the building, anti-Ayatollah graffiti. And that triggered a confrontation with one of the hostages, who was actually a revolutionary guard. He belonged to the sort of Praetorian Guard, if you like, of the Iranian regime, and he was ultra-radical, he was extremely fundamentalist. In some ways, he was just as fanatical as they were. And watching these guys drawing this sort of anti-Khomeini graffiti on the walls triggered this moment, and the cause of that was boredom. That's where it started.
Now, this detail you can only get, of course, when you're writing a book in the way that you do it. The other, I want to also talk about memory as well as, and this is in all your books, the role of memory, whether it's how people have remembered this event in talking to you about it, or the way that people have written about it and the documents you found, but also this takes me to another brilliant book of yours, The Spy and the Traitor, and the great character Oleg Godrievsky, who had an incredible memory, just a remarkable. Tell me about the role of memory in putting these stories together and the lives lived within them.
Well, memory is, for me, the kind of gold dust of these stories, because if I have a living witness who can tell me what it smelt like in a room, or the expression on her face when she spoke, or what he'd had for breakfast, or the colour of the curtains, that is wonderful. But memory is a very fallible and malleable quality. We all think our memories are truth, don't we? We all think that what we recall of the past is true, it's real, and it's real to us, but it's not truth. Truth is a different thing. Memory, I often think, and this is not my line, this is Alice Munro's line, but that memory are the narratives that we tell ourselves to make sense of the past. And they change over time. Our memories adapt and take in other people's memories. And once we've told a story a few times and we get a particular response to it, we may change our memories a bit. And it is very possible, as I discovered when researching this book, for 2 or more people to have witnessed exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, and yet have completely contrasting memories of what took place. And neither is lying. Nobody's making it up. So one has to be careful with memory because it isn't truth. And I've had many experiences, and we'll come on to 𝐭𝐿𝐵𝐿 in a moment, where I have had to tell people that actually their memories, it's not that they have false memory syndrome or anything as sort of obvious as that, but their memories are not accurate, that what they think they remember
Could not have happened.
Could not have happened. And that's often a very tricky moment. I mean, that's in some ways why I think we have siblings, is that they're there to contradict our memories. They're there to say, actually, sunshine, it wasn't like that at all, and I was there. So, don't spin that story again. So memories are absolutely crucial to me, but there is a sort of hierarchy of source material, if you like, on these stories, which is that, for me, as I think I said at the beginning, those sort of MI5 files that are written in the time that are contemporaneous, those are extraordinary because they are really very accurate. Then there's another level, which is diaries and letters and postcards and poems that are written at the time. And I'm amazed by how much there was in this story of people who actually at the time, including one of the hostages, was writing down a diary of what was taking place minute by minute. He'd never shown it to anyone. And it was just extraordinary to sort of see
one of the
this.
gunmen said, "What are you doing?" And he told him, and the gunman said, "Oh, that's good."
Yeah, the gunman said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, well, I'm writing a diary." And he said, "Oh, good. What have you put in it? What have you said about me?" He was rather vain, the kind of the lead gunman. But that's an extraordinary. And one of the policemen was also keeping a diary. One of the SAS guys too. So that's also wonderful. If you can have something that is written at the time that you can get your fingers on, that feels perfect. And then there's memoir that is written later. And then there are memories that I'm excavating from people who are living now, and that's difficult. That's complicated because often they've become fluid over 45 years. They've listened to themselves tell the same story so often that they've begun to embellish it, not intentionally. That nobody's making this up, but somehow we all do this. We all tell our stories that way. But what the wonderful thing was to have so many living witnesses to this story. So I managed to interview each of, well, not quite all of them, but there are 27 actually surviving members of the SAS who took part in this assault, of whom I interviewed 22. So to have that many people describing the same moment allows you, as it were, to sort of triangulate or multiply triangulate what really did happen. But Oleg is a very good example because Oleg's story. Oleg was a KGB officer, Oleg Gordievsky. He was recruited by British intelligence and he spied from inside the Kremlin for a decade. And he really is one of the very few spies who really have changed the course of history. We would be living in a different world if it hadn't been for Oleg Gordievsky. He was amazingly brave. He was quite ruthless in some ways. He was ideologically driven. And his escape is astonishing. I mean, he escaped from Moscow in 1985, and it's if I say so myself, no, I didn't do the escape. It's quite a story. But so I spent a lot of time with Oleg Gordievsky in the safe house where he was taken by MI5 and where he lived and died. He died about 2 months ago. And so he'd lived there all his life, and I spent hours and hours and hours in his overheated sitting room talking to him, excavating his memories. And he, as you say, he had an absolutely phenomenal memory. He was in his 80s by this point. He couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast, but he could tell you exactly which street corner he'd been standing on in 1975 and what, whose expressions on whose. But even his memory, phenomenal as it was fallible. Because I also interviewed all the MI6 officers who had run his case. And of course, they had access to the files, so they were able to go back and check on what had actually been said by whom. And elements of Oleg's own story, the one that he told repeatedly, the one that he'd written, were wrong. They just weren't right. And I'd have to say to him occasionally, and I must have interviewed him for about 140 hours in all, I had to say to him at one point, Oleg, what you've just described isn't actually the case. I said, it wasn't quite like that. I can't remember what the incident was. It was some timing question. And he'd fix me with this very hard kind of Slavic stare. And then after a little silence, he'd say, well, you know my story much better than I do then. You say whatever you want to, right? He was a tough cookie, Oleg.
Something that Oleg and the siege have in common is Margaret Thatcher, and I think we should talk about her because her response to these two stories was quite different. Well, I mean, you can talk about it. She seemed very fond of Mr. Collins.
She did. She became she took to 𝐭𝐸𝐵𝐷𝐸𝐵𝐵. The story of the siege brings out both the best and I think also the worst about Margaret Thatcher. She'd been in power for a very short time when this crisis erupted. She'd never had to deal with anything like this before. Her grip on power at this point, she wasn't even in power for a year, was still quite fragile. And yet she was absolutely clear in what she was prepared to do and what she wasn't. She laid down rules of engagement right from the beginning that never wavered. Now, that was very helpful to the SAS. That was very helpful to the police in some respects. She just drew a series of red lines and said, you know, if two people are killed, the SAS is going in. We're not going to give them what they want. They're not going to get they're not going to get this. They're not going to get that. So she was completely clear. She was also, in a way, very bold. I mean, her decision to send in the SAS was a huge gamble. She was gambling with she was gambling with a lot of lives, for one thing. I mean, she was told that there were likely to be 40% casualties in that building. That's a very high total. There wasn't. That didn't happen in the end. It was amazingly almost bloodless. But she was gambling with her future as well. I mean, if it had gone that way, if it had been a bloodbath, her premiership would have come to an end. So those in a way, she was extremely brave. She said, right, we're going in, and the buck stops with me. She knew that. She made it absolutely clear that if it went wrong, she was the person who would take responsibility for it. So that's very creditable. On the other hand, she would have made a very bad hostage negotiator because she was no good at the kind of nuance that is required for that job. So by laying down these absolutely concrete lines, she really gave the poor police negotiators nothing to negotiate with. They couldn't offer the gunmen anything because she wouldn't let them. And so, in a way, she trapped them. She trapped the whole situation. And perhaps, and this is speculation, somebody with a little more bend in their backbone would have approached this story slightly differently and would perhaps, it might not have ended in the way that it did. I mean, those gunmen were exhausted. They'd almost had enough. If she'd not lost patience, perhaps it could have been extended for a bit longer. But she was so clear on what she wanted. So that's interesting. And her approach to 𝐭𝐸𝐵𝐷𝐸 was fascinating. I mean, again, it was a bit of a gamble. I mean, to authorize his exfiltration in 1985 at a time when relations between the West and Gorbachev were improving was a pretty bold thing to do. I mean, she knew it was going to cause a real problem with the Soviet Union, and yet she went ahead with it anyway. So she felt a personal bond to 𝐭𝐸𝐵𝐷𝐸. She, at this point, by the way, she didn't even know his identity. She'd been told that there was this character. She was told his code name, knocked on, but she didn't know who he really was until he came out. And then, of course, once, as with the siege, once he had come out, and once the siege was successful, she took 100% of the credit for it.
Well, you describe a little party at the barracks after the siege where she's standing with some of the SAS guys and how at home she looked, in that sort of testosterone-fueled, I don't know whether celebration's the right word. No,
celebration is the right word. I mean, they were all milling around in Regent's Park Barracks, drinking Foster's lager. And they were all still in their combat gear, so they were all soaked in tear gas and with their camouflage paint on and so on. And they were actually watching themselves on television because this thing was then playing in a loop. And it was noticed at the time that Margaret Thatcher, as she went round, that she had a tear in her eye. Well, that might have been emotion. My suspicion is that was tear gas. It took an awful lot to make Margaret Thatcher weep, and I think she knew a really brilliant political opportunity when she found one.
How did the decisions that she made with the siege impact on the future of the SAS?
Well, it transformed the SAS overnight, actually. I mean, I can't sort of emphasise this strongly enough. I mean, nobody knew about the SAS. I mean, if you 1 in 100 people in the UK would ever have heard of the SAS. They operated totally undercover. They were very active in Northern Ireland at this point. They were operating around the world, but no one really knew about them. And they were under threat. There were people in the army who wanted to get rid of the SAS. They've always been considered to be a kind of rogue element, a slightly rogue part of the military. So they were in danger, and overnight they became celebrities. I mean, I remember it vividly myself. I even got the special SAS Action Man doll that was made afterwards, so I could do my own abseiling up and down the doll's house. You know, and young men were lining up outside recruitment centres in the UK saying, give me a balaclava helmet and a machine gun and I'll go and do this. So overnight, they became sort of incredibly famous. And there are people in the regiment, even today, who believe that this event was actually rather a negative thing for the SAS because it meant that they were no longer able to operate in the way that they had before. It's very hard, it's impossible actually, to do special operations in the limelight. I mean, if everybody's looking at you, you can't do it. So, and I think the SAS, and I'm sure this is true of the Australian SAS too, has struggled, I think, ever since to balance its own celebrity, which it likes very much, with the need for secrecy, which it likes even more. So there is a tension there, and I don't think it's ever really fully been resolved. And it really dates back, it really originates with this event.
We could pick any single person inside the siege on either side, really, and talk for hours about them. But I would like to single out PC, Trevor Locke.
Trevor Locke.
The ducking in to sip a cup of coffee at the crucial moment.
He was a wonderful, wonderful man. He too, I'm afraid, died. Two of my heroes actually died. He died about a month ago too. Trevor Locke was an officer in the Diplomatic Protection Group, which is a section of the Metropolitan Police that looks after embassies. And he had joined that part of the organisation because it was boring. Nothing ever happened. All you did was you stood on the doorstep of embassies and nodded politely to people going in and out. And that suited Trevor absolutely down to the ground. He said to me once, he said, I joined the police to help old ladies across the road. That's what I wanted to do. And he was very good at that. But so he was guarding the embassy. But guarding is a very active word for what Trevor was actually doing. Trevor was having, as you say, a cup of coffee inside, which he wasn't supposed to do. He was supposed to be standing there. And as these gunmen attacked the building, firing their machine guns, the bullets went through the plate glass door in front of him as he was sipping his cup of coffee. And the shards went straight into his face. So with blood pouring down his face, he backed into the hallway and just had time to press the emergency switch on his lapel and alert Scotland Yard to what was going on. So that was that one precious moment right at the beginning. The other thing about Trevor Locke, which is extraordinary, was that he had a gun. Now most British policemen were unarmed in the 1980s. And that was one of the reasons, actually, why the gunmen had chosen Britain, because they were assured the police don't have weapons and they won't stop you. But that was not true of the Diplomatic Protection Group. They were allowed to carry revolvers, and he had a revolver on his holster under his tunic, which the gunmen didn't see. Although they patted everyone down, they missed his gun. Trevor kept that gun on him for the next 6 days, wondering whether and when and how and if he ought to use it. And that's one of the sort of ticking elements in this story. But Trevor's was one of those extraordinary sort of accidental heroes. He had absolutely no desire to be brave. He didn't think he was brave. And yet, without him, I don't want to give too much of the story away, but without him, this story would have had a very different ending to it. He managed to keep everyone calm. He managed to play a brilliant part as a kind of intermediary between the gunmen and the police on the outside. He was there all the way through. And without him, I think it would have been a bloodbath. He flatly refused to accept that. Even from me, I mean, I got to know him quite well, and he kept saying, "Oh, you're trying to turn me into a hero, Ben." He said, "I'm not a hero." I'll tell you how modest he was. He was awarded the George Cross, which is the highest medal for gallantry in the UK. And he put it in his wife's sewing basket and immediately forgot where he'd put it. And lost it for 5 years. He just couldn't find the thing. I mean, that was exactly how kind of uninterested he was.
Gallantry is such a great word
Isn't it?
for him.
Yeah.
Because he did things. There was one chair in the room, wasn't there? There was one sort of, and you describe it almost like a sort of throne, and he sat on it. He decided that he was the one. He never took his policeman's hat off.
No.
Because he felt that, I mean, and in a way, he really was different from all the others because he knew he had that gun.
Yeah.
And he was.
Well, he was an authority figure, although he didn't want to be.
No.
I mean, he wasn't one of those sort of have-a-go heroes. He was a quiet East London Bobby who wanted a quiet life. But when the moment came, he found this reserve of resilience and gallantry, if you like, that actually kept everybody going. Without him, it would have been, I think, a very, very different story.
It seemed like everybody found a role, more or less. There were some more than Morris. Was it Morris who
Morris was one
made the tea and kept things clean, and the people that did? But I mean, you say this, in your writing that you don't know what you're going to do in those situations until you're in them.
I think that's right. I mean, that turned out in a way to be the inadvertent theme of this book. I didn't think it would be when I first started writing it, but actually it ended up being a story about character and individual personality and what perfectly ordinary people like you and I would do in extraordinary circumstances over which we have no control. I mean, that's what it ended up being. And it is one thing to be a trained SAS soldier. You know, you've had years of expecting a moment like this. It's another thing to be a trained policeman. You've also been given an idea of the sort of conflictual situations that you may face. You may not want them, like Trevor, or you may embrace them. But most of us have not been trained for the unexpected. Most of us have no idea how we would really cope, and we're not all built of straight-grained timber. You know, we all come in different, often complicated and unexpected and gnarly shapes. And some people in this building responded with a kind of purity and sort of resilience, including some of the women, actually, that they never knew they had. Others didn't. Others tried to survive. Others did very natural things. Others just kept their heads down and read The Day of the Jackal and just prayed it was all going to go away. I think I might have done that. I found myself continually asking myself, as I was writing the book, what would I have done? How would I have dealt with this story? I don't know how to answer that question, and I actually genuinely don't think anyone can answer that question until they find themselves in that sort of situation. You can train all you like. And this is again true of the SAS guys. Some were extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary in their capacity to adapt to a terrifying and changing situation. Others, less so. You know, it left great damage on many people. And so it ended up not really being quite the sort of boy's own paper adventure story. Although, I mean, the last 11 minutes are quite exciting. But it turned out to be about people and about how they behave and how they never quite know how they're going to behave.
And, I mean, they've each, of course, had to live with the consequences of how they behaved. And from within them that's not black and white. I mean, I just think anybody that can survive that without harming someone else is, wow,
extraordinary.
Yeah,
I mean, there's one character. I mean, one of the BBC journalists, a man called Chris Kramer, who either became or faked, or somewhere in between the two, great illness. I mean, he was not well, but as he himself said afterwards, I exaggerated it. And he did this deliberately because he wanted to get out. And it worked. He managed to persuade them to release him effectively by sort of laying it on with a trowel. Once he got out, he recovered immediately. Now, he never forgave himself for that. He believed that had been an act of cowardice. And he really beat himself up about it for the rest of his life. But I didn't agree with that. I didn't think it really was an act of cowardice. I think any of us might have done that. If we'd seen a chink, just a chink of light of a way of getting out of this situation, would you not have seized it? Would you not? I don't know. I don't know whether I would have done. But then the reverse is also extraordinary, because there's an extraordinary moment when the gunmen who've become to trust Trevor Locke, they've become to sort of believe in him, as the other hostages have. And on the penultimate night, they thought they heard noises downstairs. They thought someone was trying to break into the building. And they said to Locke, they said, Mr. Trevor, go down and find out what's happening. So he went downstairs on his own to sort of check out what was going on. Now, at that moment, he could have walked out of the front door. He could simply have opened the front door and walked away. And he would have been absolutely able to justify it afterwards, because he could have said, I was the policeman, I needed to get information to the authorities, I was the person who could have sort of told them what was going on inside. But he didn't. And indeed, even more than that, not only did he not walk away or run away, it never crossed his mind. It never occurred to him that he could have just saved his own skin and walked away. So who knows? Who knows how we'll respond?
The relationship and the shifts in the relationship between the hostages and the gunmen is a remarkable part of this story. The twists and turns and the dependencies, the syndromes that you write of that go both ways, Stockholm syndrome and the Lima syndrome. But it's the detail where you see it. To me, anyway, more than those well-known. A sentence where somebody's obviously told you that at some point the gunman washed their underpants, however many days, and that there's a hostage looks at that and says, well, anyone doing that washing is not going to be a mass murderer. These sort of insight. And then, again, through cigarettes. They were just about all smokers.
Everybody. From the embassy World Snooker Final all the way through to the embassy siege. Everyone was singing.
It made me think of that Richard Klein, The Cigarettes Are Sublime. You could give a chapter to
I certainly could. It made me want to take it up again, I can tell you.
Yeah. But so that at some point the gunman ran out of cigarettes, which, if I'd been in the police command, I would not have let that happen. But, of course, they were just getting them off the hostages.
They were getting them off the hostages, and the police rather cleverly worked out that this was a way of gaining a certain amount of trust from the gunmen, because they began to offer them cigarettes and leave cigarettes on the front door. Not very many, but enough that they would smoke them all and then want more, and that's a way of gaining trust and creating a kind of... it was quite cleverly done, the way that they would put some cigarettes in, but not too many, just to keep the addicts on the hook. It was clever. It was not stupid. But those are the little details. But I mean, you were asking about sources, and those conversations that I relate in the book, those are real conversations. Because one of the other things that was going on, in addition to people like Sim Harris writing down his diary and so on, was that the police and MI5 were drilling audio probes into this building. So from either side. So on one side, you had the Royal College of General Practitioners, which is a huge... I should describe the building, by the way. I mean, it's an extraordinary place. It's a 6-storey, vast Georgian townhouse overlooking Hyde Park. It's a beautiful building. It's got 56 rooms, 6 floors and a basement. One side was and still is the Ethiopian embassy, and the other side is this Royal College of General Practitioners. Now, the police technicians in MI5 were drilling these micro probes into the walls to listen into conversations taking place inside that building. And I've seen some of the transcripts. They're quite hard to follow. They take place in 3 different languages. Some of it's translated, some of it's not. But it allows me to reconstruct the conversations from reality, from what was going on inside that building. And that's again, those are contemporaneous historical documents that tell you what was going on. I mean, those audio probes, they sound very rustic to us now because, of course, you'd be able to do it from long distance with no problem now. Then you literally had to drill these things with hand drills into the walls and then insert these long probes, and the walls were that thick, so you had to push these things really, really carefully until you just got to the plasterwork on the other side, and then you could hear what was going on inside. At the same time, they were lowering bugs down the chimneys, so there were 16 chimneys on this building, and in each fireplace by the end, there was an eavesdropping device hanging down in the fireplace, just out of sight, listening to what was going on inside.
And Trevor Locke saying to the gunman, "It's just the mice, it's just the mice."
Yes, there are these bizarre, absurd moments. So, as I said, they had to do it with hand drills. And the hand drills made a very distinctive and rather loud squeaking noise. As, meet, 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 as they were going in. And at one point, the lead gunman said, Mr. Trevor, we're about to be attacked." And Trevor sort of put on his police cap and went upstairs and listened to the noise. He knew exactly what it was and said, Tawfiq, I think we've got mice. Yeah, got mice in the skirting boards. But actually, that conversation was overheard by the police eavesdroppers. And so they realized that actually this drilling was causing a problem. It was adding to the tension inside. So they did 2 absolutely extraordinary things, which sound bonkers. But they worked out that to cover this small noise, they needed to make a much bigger noise. So they called up the gas board. And they had 2 men in overalls drive up in a van with 2 very big pneumatic drills and start drilling a completely unnecessary hole right in front of the embassy. So they made a huge amount of noise. And so the police were sort of drilling away. And of course that drove everyone completely mad because it was just deafening, including the poor police negotiators who couldn't hear what they were saying on the telephone. So they stopped doing that and they did something even more extraordinary. They contacted the Civil Aviation Authority at Heathrow and arranged for jumbo jets to be diverted from Heathrow on landing and to fly directly over the embassy, but a bit lower, to make this, well, they were a lot louder then, jets, than they are now, over the embassy. So the police technicians in the MI5 would wait until they heard a plane coming. And as it was going over, they'd drill frantically away into the walls. And then as the plane sort of disappeared, they'd stop.
And I mean, the guys making the decisions about all of this, one of them had to go home, didn't he? He was so stressed. This is another whole sort of bunker of incredible stress. And some of it sounds very coarse. We'll just go and dig up a road or... but it's also clever. It's very clever. And how are those sort of tactics a mainstay? I mean, I don't want to get into too much about what goes on today, but is that what we sort of depend on? It's like spycraft is still so much of it is coarse. I'm going to be walking past this building with a Mars bar, and if I take it out and eat it, then you're going to defect.
Yep. It does sound very sort of simple in a way, doesn't it? I mean, I know for a fact that sort of hostage negotiation techniques are much more sophisticated these days. There's a much higher level of training. I mean, these guys they had a little bit of training, the hostage negotiators, but they hadn't really had any experience. They did, however, bring in, and this was quite enlightened for 1980, they did bring in a psychiatrist, a wonderful man called Professor John Gunn, who's very much still around and is Professor of Forensic Psychiatry at London University. They brought him in to advise on the psychological aspects of what was going on, to try to interpret what the conversations both inside the building that were being overheard and what was the sort of dialogue that was taking place between the police and the gunman, and to try to interpret it in really quite a sophisticated psychological way, sophisticated for the time. Now I think it is far more scientific and far more understood. These sort of rather catch-all terms of Stockholm syndrome and Lima syndrome. I mean, they're very useful terms, but I think the whole science of hostage negotiation is on a different plane these days.
And meanwhile, of course, is the media outside, and as you said at the very beginning, this is new. This taking place live. It's been 6 days, and you describe it almost sort of carnival atmosphere. There's one section of them drinking incredible red wine and some sort of selection of cheeses, and there's a TV station that's bought them all bicycles so that they can get back to their stations without being in traffic jams.
As a journalist of 35 years, there is no greater pleasure, really, than a mass press event, because the bosses are not going to query your expenses, and there they were for 6 days, and it was like
nothing happening.
With nothing happening, with a journalistic free-for-all. So they were absolutely loving it. I mean, I know quite a few of the journalists who were there at the time, sort of veterans of the times, and they were all competing with each other, of course. So they were all trying to steal each other's stories and get the scoop and so on. And at one point, the man from the Daily Mail, which was the richest paper at that point, turned up with an astonishing new gizmo, which was called a mobile telephone. It was literally a telephone that you could call anywhere in the world, and he was incredibly proud of it. I mean, it weighed about 20 pounds and sat in a kind of great wooden box that he had to bring, but he was showing off with this and saying, I'm just going to go and ring my office with this. And of course, the other hacks all got furious about this and worked out very quickly that it was very easy to intercept. So they began listening in on what the Daily Mail was filing on his mobile. So it was a very early bit of inspired phone hacking.
When you look back on that reporting, how good was it?
Do you know what? It was pretty good, actually. I mean, it was the old days of very inventive kind of hackery, of pretty much anything goes. I mean, the police were trying to keep everybody back, rightly. The press were trying to get in, rightly. And so they were doing all sorts of naughty things. Like at the back of the building, ITN managed to smuggle in a camera and were filming live from the back of the building as they went in from a secret location. Now, you can say that was journalistic endeavour. You can say that it was very dangerous, because if the gunman had been watching television, they would have seen the attack taking place in real time. So the whole question of evolving news fascinates me, because it had never really been quite as live as this before. And it was all taking place in the context of the other embassy siege. So the American embassy in Tehran was still under siege as well. There were 55 American hostages in there. They'd been there for 123 days by this point. And so everyone thought that the two events were linked, which in some ways they were, sort of peripherally linked. But it was the biggest news story in the world. I mean, 400 journalists encamped outside that building for 6 days. And actually, when you look back on it, the level of reporting was extraordinarily good. And both the Times and the Observer, then the two biggest newspapers, produced instant books within a week. An amazing piece of sort of journalistic endeavour. And the books hold up. They are still pretty accurate about what was really going on. Absolutely remarkable.
You describe it, as this monumental event in British history. How did it change Britain?
Well, it changed all sorts of things, really. I mean, I think in Britain, it gave a kind of slightly artificial post-imperial burst of pride. There was a feeling in Britain that this was evidence that Britain could still, punch above its weight, and it could still, I'm not sure that was terribly healthy in some ways. I mean, although it had some sort of comic elements. I mean, just before this, the Americans had tried to liberate their hostages in Tehran, called Operation Eagle Claw, which was an absolute disaster. It went totally wrong, and tragically, quite a few American servicemen were killed. Before it ever got off the ground, they were going to take helicopters in and try and snatch out it just didn't work. And the contrast between, huge America, not being able to pull it off, and plucky little Britain somehow being able to do it. And of course, Thatcher couldn't resist ringing up Jimmy Carter afterwards and saying, if there's anything we can do to help, We're always here for you, Jim. You know, that kind of just sticking the needle in a bit. So there was a sort of cultural element to it. The SAS became very famous. The IRA were watching this operation too. You know, everyone was watching snooker that day, and they also took some lessons from this. It didn't necessarily change the situation in Northern Ireland, but Thatcher had made it absolutely clear that she was not and never going to negotiate with terrorists. And that took that conflict onto a different plane. It also forged between the Thatcher government and it also, her popularity soared. I mean, her premiership was pretty much assured from that time. But it forged this very close relationship between the Thatcher government and the military. I mean, she felt that she had a special bond with the men in uniform. And in a way that played out in the Falklands. Part of her approach to the Falklands conflict, which sort of erupted 2 years later, is informed by this event, that the two events are linked. They were certainly linked in her own mind. She felt she could do military.
Oh, God, you've just given me that horrible memory in the book of Prince Andrew.
Yes. Yeah, the poor old villain of this piece. Well, not poor old, but, you know, Prince Andrew, who was then a very young helicopter pilot, was also watching this stuff on television unfold over the 6 days. And a message arrived at Zulu Control, the police headquarters, saying His Royal Highness would like to visit, would like to sit in on the police negotiations. And John Dello, who was the police commissioner, said, absolutely not. We're not having some pampered prince wandering around in here while we're trying to, you know, save lives. But Prince Andrew is a very difficult person to say no to, then and now, and he was very, very persistent about it. In fact, the only time that John Dello ever lost his temper was when Prince Andrew, you know, sent in yet another message for the third time saying, I'll only need some sandwiches and I'll sit in the corner, and said, absolutely no way is that man coming anywhere near here. So he was banned. But poor old Prince Andrew, I mean, he gets a sort of walk-on villain's part in this story. He did eventually turn up, actually, but after it was all over.
You could not make it up.
I was so thrilled when I found Prince Andrew in this story. I thought, that's great. That's a, you know, ka-ching. I can get him in.
The little circles and the big circles of connections in this story with all your stories are just incredible. We've only got a couple of minutes. What are you working on now?
Well, I'm deep in another spy story. In fact, I've been up in the Sofitel typing it away this morning. It's a strange story. It's a fascinating story. Unlike the Oleg story, it is a story that nobody knows about. It's been suppressed for 40 years, and it's the story of a Russian KGB officer, a man called Vladimir 𝐭𝐡𝐻𝐿, who was a very senior KGB officer in Tehran just after the revolution. So 1980, I'm back in Iran again, 1980, 1981, 1982. And he was a huge Russian, 6'6", huge, great man. And he volunteered to spy for the West. He flipped over, and MI6 recruited him, and they began to run him as a double agent inside the KGB, and he had access to everything. He knew everything about the Middle East operations, and he began to unpick it. But it very swiftly transpired, and this is where the story gets quite strange, is that his reason for doing this, unlike Oleg Gordievsky, who was an ideological spy, his reason for doing it, I mean, he was very opposed to the regime, but his main reason for doing it was, wait for it, because he suffered from erectile dysfunction. And he believed that the West had medicines that would cure it, which it did not, because Viagra would not be invented for another 14 years. But MI5 pretended it did and began to run him on little red pills, which were vitamin tablets, in the hope that the placebo effect would kick in. And so I won't give it all away, but this is it's a strange story. It's a very important story because one of the things that 𝐭𝐡𝐻𝐿 revealed was that the Soviet Union was planning a coup in Iran. It was planning to set up the still surviving Iranian Communist Party, the only other party that was allowed to operate under the Ayatollah, to set them up in a coup. The guns were already in, the money was already in, the Soviets were already in Afghanistan. This was going to be the next domino. They're going to roll across the border. And when 𝐭𝐡𝐮 revealed this to the West, to MI6, MI6 told the CIA, and the CIA said, right, we've got to tell the Iranians. So a secret meeting was set up. They told the Iranians, and within about 3 months, 6,000 members of the Iranian Communist Party were rounded up, of whom 1,200 were executed. And that was the last opposition to the Ayatollah. That is the foundation stone of the Iranian state. So when we talk about the theocratic tyranny that is Iran today, the origins of that lie in this very strange psychosexual story of the spy codenamed Redwood.
Wow.
It's quite a tale.
That is something, isn't it?
It's quite a tale. As you can tell, I'm very hyped on it.
No, so are we now.
I'm very worried about, if anyone ever looks through my Google searches, I get the strange, I mean, they're all about erectile dysfunction, so I get the strangest ads popping up these days.
MI6, they're just fantastical. Thank you so much for coming to Melbourne and coming to Australia. It's just a huge thrill to meet you and to have you here at Wheeler Centre. I can tell how much everybody here has loved it tonight. Enjoy the rest of your trip.
Before I go, can I just do one quick thing? One of the soldiers involved in this story was a man called Tom Morell, who was Fijian by birth. He abseiled down the back of the building. He was very badly injured. He was astonishingly brave. He's one of the key figures in this story. I know that his son, Richard, is in the audience tonight, and I just wanted to do a little shout out to Tom Morell, who I had the honour of sharing a stage with. He lives in New Zealand now. I shared a stage with him in Auckland last week, and he's an absolutely extraordinary man. So I just wanted to do that.
It's such a great part of the story. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Ben Macintyre, everybody, and he will be signing. You've got to read this book. It's like you don't know the ending. It is a brilliant book. Thanks so much, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Sally.